The silence of the barren lands isn't empty. It's heavy. It's a physical weight that presses against the glass of your cab, trying to find a microscopic seal to fail so it can pour in and freeze your marrow. People think the danger of the ice roads is the cold. They're wrong. The danger is the rhythm. David gripped the steering wheel of his Peterbilt, his knuckles white against the worn leather. He called the truck the Iron Widow. She was a 389 model, jet black with chrome that caught the ghostly shimmer of the moon. Behind him, he was pulling a double tanker, 40 tons of volatile diesel fuel. One wrong move, one crack in the plate, and he wouldn't just drown, he'd become a permanent part of the permafrost. 20 years, David whispered, his voice a dry rasp. On the ice, you talk to yourself to make sure you're still real. If you don't hear a human voice for 6 hours, the hallucinations start. The ice giants begin to walk in your peripheral vision, and the ghost lights dance on the horizon. Driving the Tibbitt to Contwoyto Winter Road is a gamble with a god that doesn't like you. David lived by 3 commandments. Never stop. If you stop, your tires will melt into the ice just enough to freeze solid. When you try to pull away, you'll tear the tread right off the rims, 25 kilometers per hour. Exactly. If you go faster, you create a shallow water wave under the ice. That wave travels ahead of you, builds pressure, and when it hits the shore or a pressure ridge, it reflects back. The collision of those 2 waves will shatter 5 feet of ice like a hammer hitting a mirror. Listen. David turned the radio off. No music, no CB chatter. He needed to hear the ice singing. When the weight of a 70-ton rig moves over the frozen Great Slave Lake, the ice groans. It pops. It sends out long, booming cracks that sound like heavy artillery. As long as the cracks are dry and sharp, you're okay. If they sound wet, a dull, thudding squelch, the lake is opening its mouth to swallow you. Tonight, the sky was angry. The aurora borealis wasn't just a faint shimmer. It was a neon green frenzy, whipping across the stars like a lash. The locals called it the Green Scream. It was so bright it cast long, dancing shadows of the truck across the white expanse of the lake. The thermometer on the dash read 52 degrees. At that temperature, steel becomes brittle like glass. If you dropped a wrench, it would shatter. David checked his mirrors. Nothing but white dust and the endless, flat horizon of the lake. He was 30 miles from the nearest land bridge. He was in the deep zone, where the water beneath the ice dropped to 1,000 feet. Then he saw the flicker. At first, he thought it was a frost plume, steam rising from a fresh crack. But it was too vertical, too still. He slowed down, his heart hammering against his ribs. Don't stop, David. Rule number 1. Don't stop. As the LED headlights of the Peterbilt cut through the swirling snow, the figure came into focus. It was a woman. She was standing directly in the center of the ice track, blocking his path. She wore a thin, white summer dress that fluttered in the sub-zero wind as if it were a July breeze. No coat, no boots. Her feet were bare on the ice. David's mind screamed at him. It's a trick of the light. It's the nitrogen in your blood. Keep driving. But he didn't. He watched her face. She wasn't shivering. Her skin wasn't blue with necrosis. It was pale and smooth, like polished marble. She didn't wave for help. She didn't scream. She just stood there, staring into the chrome grille of his truck with eyes that seemed to absorb the green light from the sky. David's hand moved to the air brake. "Don't do it," he hissed to himself. The air brakes hissed, a long, violent spray of compressed air that sounded like a warning. The Peterbilt groaned as it came to a halt. The ice beneath the tires began to protest immediately, a deep thrum-thrum-thrum vibration that David could feel in his teeth. He was breaking every rule he'd ever lived by. He leaned over and pushed the passenger door open. "Get in!" he yelled, the freezing air rushing into the cab and instantly turning his breath into a cloud of ice crystals. "You're going to freeze. Get in now." The woman didn't rush. She climbed the steps of the massive truck with a slow, deliberate grace. As she stepped into the cab, the interior lights didn't seem to illuminate her. They seemed to bend around her. She sat in the air ride seat and stared straight ahead. David slammed the door shut and jammed the truck into gear. He had to get moving before the ice gave way under his stationary weight. As he accelerated, the truck felt heavier. The engine roared, struggling to pull the load as if the gravity in the cab had suddenly doubled. He stole a glance at his passenger. She hadn't looked at him. She hadn't said thank you. "I'm David," he said, his voice trembling. Where did you come from? There's nothing out here for 100 miles. The woman didn't respond, but as she sat there, David noticed something that chilled him more than the Arctic wind. The heater was blasting at full capacity, but the frost on the passenger side window wasn't melting. It was growing. It was spreading across the glass in intricate, jagged patterns. Patterns that looked like skeletal hands reaching for the throat of the driver. And then, the gift began. The silence inside the cab was no longer the absence of sound. It was a physical entity, cold and suffocating. David's breath came in ragged, shallow bursts that hung in the air like ghostly ribbons. He had the heater dialed to the maximum, the vents screaming with 80-degree air, yet he watched in disbelief as a thin layer of rime began to crawl across the steering wheel. He glanced at the woman. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap. Her skin was so pale it looked translucent, and the green glow of the northern lights through the windshield made her appear as if she were carved from the ice itself. "Look, miss," David started, his voice cracking. "I don't know who you are or how you got out there, but we're a long way from the next camp. I can get you to the Lockhart station. They've got a medic and—" She didn't turn her head. Instead, she slowly raised a thin, pale finger and pointed at a spot on the dark horizon. As she pointed, the truck's dashboard went into a seizure. The needles on the oil pressure and temperature gauges began to dance wildly, swinging from 0 to redline. The GPS screen flickered into a static-filled mess of garbled coordinates, and the radio, which had been turned off, emitted a low-frequency hum that vibrated the very bolts of the frame. "What is that? What's wrong with the rig?" David gripped the wheel harder. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot rang out from beneath the front tires. The ice buckled. A massive pressure ridge, hidden by a thin veil of blown snow, loomed ahead. It was a jagged wall of frozen water that should have sheared the front axle clean off. David braced for the impact, closing his eyes. The truck didn't hit. It glided. The Peterbilt seemed to lift an inch off the surface, the suspension absorbing a shock that should have been fatal. When David opened his eyes, they were past it. He checked his mirrors. The pressure ridge behind him was shattered, a ruin of ice blocks the size of refrigerators. Any other driver would have been at the bottom of the lake. He looked at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. "How did you saw that? You warned me?" She didn't answer. She only pointed again. The travel tension began to settle in like a fever. David felt a strange, tingling sensation in his fingertips. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see frostbite. What he saw was far worse. Under the dim amber glow of the cabin lights, the skin on his knuckles was tightening. The vibrant tan color of a man who worked outdoors. was fading into a sickly, translucent yellow. A small brown spot, a liver spot, blossomed on his thumb as he watched. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue. It's just the fatigue, he told himself. But then came the next warning. The woman pointed sharply to the left, toward the open, featureless white. David didn't hesitate this time. He yanked the wheel, sending the 40-ton tanker into a controlled slide. Seconds later, the section of the road he had just vacated collapsed. A blowhole, a pocket of trapped methane, erupted, sending a geyser of black water and frozen mud 50 feet into the air. If he had stayed on the path, the weight of the fuel would have dragged him down into 1,000 feet of liquid dark. As he corrected the slide, a sharp pain shot through his chest. It wasn't a heart attack. It was the feeling of his ribs becoming brittle. He looked in the small vanity mirror on the sun visor. The man in the mirror was changing. The deep lines around his eyes were becoming canyons. His beard, which had been a salt and pepper gray, was now a shocking, brittle white. His eyes, once sharp and clear, were clouding over with the milky haze of cataracts. "What are you doing to me?" he gasped. His voice was no longer a rugged baritone. It was thin, whistling through a throat that felt like it was lined with sand. The woman finally turned her head. Her eyes weren't eyes at all. They were spheres of cracked glass, reflecting the endless white of the road outside. She wasn't a girl. She was a vessel. She pointed again, this time at the floorboards. David looked down and saw the metal floor beginning to rust in real time. The Iron Widow was aging with him. The chrome began to pit, and the leather of the seats cracked and peeled. He realized the horrific trade. The ice road was a hungry thing. It demanded a sacrifice for every mile of safe passage. Usually, it took the truck and the driver all at once, a sudden crack, a plunge, and silence. But she was different. She was a siphon. She was taking his years, his vitality, his very life force, and feeding it to the road to keep the ice solid beneath his wheels. "Stop!" David croaked, his fingers now gnarled and trembling like old roots. I can't give any more." He tried to hit the brakes, but his leg lacked the strength to depress the pedal. His muscles had withered to stringy sinew. He was a passenger in his own body, a battery being drained to power a ghost ship. The woman leaned closer. She didn't touch him, but he could feel the cold radiating from her. A cold so absolute it transcended temperature. It was the cold of the grave, the cold of forgotten things at the bottom of the world. Outside, the northern lights began to pulse in time with David's failing heartbeat. Green, black, green, black. The truck sped up. The engine, despite its rusted exterior, screamed with an unnatural power. They were fly fishing across the ice, moving at speeds that should have shattered the road into 1 billion pieces. But everywhere she pointed, the ice held. It turned to stone beneath them, anchored by the decades of life she was stripping from David's bones. He looked at the odometer. The miles were ticking over faster than possible. 50 miles, 60, 70. He was nearing the end of the lake, nearing the shoreline where the ice road met the solid earth of the tundra. "Please," David whispered, a single tear freezing to his cheek before it could fall. "Let me go." The woman opened her mouth. No sound came out, but the air in the cab suddenly filled with the scent of old, stagnant water and wet earth. She pointed one last time, straight ahead at the looming dark mass of the shore. The shoreline of the Arctic tundra loomed ahead like the jagged teeth of a beast. For any other trucker, the sight of solid ground meant salvation. For David, it felt like a finish line he wasn't meant to cross. His vision was a blur of gray shadows. His hands, once capable of hauling heavy chains and wrestling steering wheels through blizzards, were now skeletal claws shaking violently against the rim of the wheel. Every breath was a struggle, a whistling rattle in a chest that felt hollowed out, as if his internal organs had withered into dried husks. The Peterbilt roared, a sound that was no longer mechanical. It was a guttural metallic scream. The truck hit the on-ramp, the transition point where the floating ice met the frozen soil of the mainland. The violent jolt nearly shattered David's brittle spine. Then, the silence returned. But it wasn't the silence of the road. It was the silence of a tomb. The truck slowed to a crawl, the engine idling with a wet, rhythmic thumping. The headlights flickered, their beams dimming as if the battery had been drained of its very soul. The woman in the white dress didn't move to open the door. She remained seated, her cracked glass eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windshield. "Who? What are you?" David managed to wheeze. His voice was a ghost of its former self, barely a vibration in the freezing air. She didn't turn to look at him, but for the first time, she spoke. The sound didn't come from her throat. It erupted from the truck's speakers, a distorted, overlapping chorus of voices, men, women, and children, all speaking in a singular, chilling monotone. The dashboard lights pulsed in rhythm with the words. "The ice wants a body, David. It always takes a body. It has been hungry for you since the first mile. It remembered your scent from 20 years ago. It has been waiting for the weight of your life to settle into its depths." David's heart gave a weak, fluttering jump. I didn't fall. You saved me." "No," the voices resonated, shaking the glass of the cab. "I didn't save you. I bought you. The ice is a merchant, and it only accepts one currency: time. Tonight, the lake will not take your body. It has already taken your tomorrow." A sudden, blinding flash of green light from the aurora borealis filled the cabin, so bright that David had to shield his clouded eyes. When the light faded, the passenger seat was empty. There was no sound of a door opening, no footprints in the snow outside. The seat wasn't even damp from her presence. It was bone dry and covered in a fine layer of grey dust. But there, resting on the cracked leather of the dashboard, was a small silver locket. It hung from a tarnished chain, swaying gently with the vibration of the idling engine. With a trembling, liver-spotted hand, David reached for it. His joints popped like dry twigs. He fumbled with the clasp, his numb fingers barely able to find the edge. Finally, it snapped open. Inside was a photograph, but it wasn't a family portrait. It was a picture of a truck, his truck. The black Peterbilt was resting on the silt of the lake bed, 300 feet below the surface. The windshield was smashed, and the chrome grille was choked with prehistoric weeds. In the driver's seat of the sunken wreck was a man. He was young, his face full of life and fire, his beard dark and trimmed. It was David. Not the David of tonight, but the David of 20 years ago. The realization hit him with the force of a head-on collision. 20 years ago, on his very first run, he had felt the ice crack. He had felt the truck tip. He had felt the water rush into his lungs. He remembered a woman in white reaching through the glass, offering him a hand. He thought he had survived. He thought he had just been lucky. He hadn't been lucky. He had been on credit. David looked up at the rearview mirror. He didn't recognize the man staring back. The face in the glass was 80, maybe 90 years old. The skin was draped over his skull like wet parchment. His eyes were sunken pits of milky white. He looked like a man who had lived a long, exhausting life. Except he had no memories of those years. They had been harvested in a single night. He looked at his hands. They were translucent now. He could see the pale, brittle bones beneath the skin. He looked back at the locket. The image was changing. The younger David in the sunken truck was beginning to fade, turning into a shadow. He understood now. The hitchhiker wasn't a guardian angel. She was a debt collector for the frozen deep. She allowed certain men to keep driving, to keep moving, but she collected their years like interest on a loan. He had reached the end of his term. The engine of the Peterbilt gave one final, shuddering gasp and died. The lights flickered out, plunging the cab into total darkness. The heater stopped, and the sub-zero Arctic air began to reclaim the space. David leaned his head back against the seat. He didn't feel cold anymore. He just felt light, as if the weight of the 40-ton tanker and the weight of his own body were finally drifting away. Outside, the northern lights began to dim. The green scream faded into a dull, distant hum. The next morning, a supply convoy found the truck parked perfectly at the edge of the road. The rig was a rusted ruin, looking as if it had sat in a salt marsh for 50 years. The tires were flat, the chrome was pitted, and the frame was snapped. When they opened the door, they found the cab empty. There was no driver, no body. The only thing they found was a silver locket sitting on the dash.